Hi, Michael.
Hi, Jordy. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thank you for taking your time and explaining for us about the globalization and what it has to do with the film industry.
Excited
S-
to.
I've heard you were in the film production work, right?
Correct. Yes, I founded my production company here in Los Angeles called Pan Graham Entertainment. I also have a production company with some London producing partners called Interstellar Entertainment, where I did the Michael Mann movie Ferrari, and we also have a horror comedy creature feature called Ick that was at the Toronto Film Festival. And I also do some science docu-series with some producing partners in Uruguay. They're based in Montevideo. And then working with some screenwriters from Germany, doing some German Chinese TV series, German Chinese, or actually US Chinese film and animation. So we're developing some projects right now. So very much it's a cross. I love doing cross language, cross cultural, cross country productions, whether it's film or TV.
Wow, like that's really amazing. Um, you just mentioned China and UK and Germany and all those countries, and which one of those would you say has the biggest influence on the film industry?
It's really interesting because the US still, due to Hollywood, is the biggest film industry. Just on purely like soft power impact. It doesn't mean that there aren't great local films and everything from UK, Germany, Mexico, Korea, Japan, and so on, and particularly even China. But there isn't really one country that has that dominance where stories from one country get seen by the rest of the world, right? Like Hollywood has always been good at that for the last over 100 years. A story in the U.S., you can actually show it in Germany, France, in general. These are generalizations. Um, I know China, for example, you bring up China, they they actually have a huge film industry, and they're actually one of their films, Neza 2, which actually is a really fun film. It's an animation film. It was one of the largest box office films in the world ever. And people said, "Oh my gosh, it's showing China's dominance, in storytelling around the world." However, the majority of that box office of that Chinese animation state was all in China and maybe some Southeast Asia. They kept saying, "Oh, there's going to be dominance and it's going to go to Hollywood," but it was such a small percentage of box office here or even in the Western countries, like in Europe, that it's still a very localized. It's state what's made in China stays in China. And they want to have a soft power. China wants to do what Hollywood does is say, we'll tell Chinese stories so the rest of the world sees it. But there's very, very, very few examples of where that's happened. It doesn't mean it may happen, but it hasn't happened really yet, to the same extent that you see, the way Hollywood does.
And would you say Hollywood should be considered, I don't know, concerned about China's success in the movie industry?
Yes, it depends. It's a very good question because it depends like who's answering it. Like so from me in Hollywood, I would say it would well, in general, everyone wants to see good stories put out there, regardless around the world, right? I think the issue you're seeing some geopolitics playing where, China says only this number of movies are allowed in China, right? You don't have that in the US and in most parts of the world, most. There's always countries that put limits on how many movies outside a country can go into their own. But in general, we don't have that. It's a very purely capitalistic, like it does well, money wise, it does well story wise. People want it. You can do it here in the US, and I'm assuming it's also the same in Germany. Now, China, they actually do put, quotas on the number of films that are allowed from outside of China. It doesn't even matter US, it even applies to Japan and Europe and so on. They've tightened it up. It's always been there, for the last at least 12 plus years. But it might be getting a little bit tighter, but it's always been there, and I think that's where Hollywood feels it's unfair, on that part. However, hopefully there are more stories that could be told around the world. Hopefully China creates better movies that get seen, because then more people want to go to the movies to see it, but that hasn't been the case yet.
And would you say, like, because I've heard that China is considering to ban US movies, and could you tell me if that's true and what we should know about that?
I don't know if it's true because everything is changing every hour, every day. Um, it's hard to say because that is more of a political aspect of it, and it's so hard to understand what China is going to do versus what, the administration here in the US is going to do, right? The interesting thing is that it's this tends to be more storytelling and service. It's more of like a service in a way, like a storytelling, and it's less of like here's some steel or here's wood or here's a product, right? I mean, you could argue it is a product. They might. I think the percentage is so small right now. I mean, okay, so I'll give an example. Around 10 years ago, China was opening up, and they were putting hundreds of millions of dollars in the U.S. to actually be involved with Hollywood. China companies buying Legendary. They were buying AMC, which is a big theater chain in the U.S. Legendary is a big production company that does a lot with Warner Brothers, and so you had Wanda company in China buying a lot of American companies, which is not unusual. Japan did that. Sony Pictures bought Columbia. You had that way back in the day. Germany was involved with buying studios, so you see it happen from time to time, like in generations. So you saw that big happening in China coming into the US, and they were putting in hundreds of millions of dollars, and learning how the storytelling, was. Then, because the government in China can do it, they just kind of stopped it immediately, because the US was considered a threat because some of the movies were doing really, really well. And I've actually seen that where I was working on that Quentin Tarantino movie called Django Unchained, and it got into China. So at the time, what I'm trying to say is at the time, movies were being greenlit, and greenlit means they get approved internally, they get the money and funding by the US, a big blockbuster to make it, knowing that, oh, we'll make this much, maybe this much money in China. So then they wouldn't make the movie if it didn't make money in China. So they're like, oh, we can make this money in China too. When we make the movie, we'll greenlight the films. The problem is that you can't control whether it actually gets into China. They might change it. So Django Unchained was a good example where it got in. It did extremely well the first weekend, but it was doing so well, it was the local Chinese movies were not doing as well as the Quentin Tarantino's. So it looked bad to China. So China government said, oh, we're going to take it out of theaters. Like literally just yanked it out, which you would never do in any other country, right? And over time you saw it getting more constricted. So now Hollywood does not necessarily greenlight movies assuming it gets into China. So they has to make its money outside of China first. Now, if it does get into China, that's kind of like a cherry on top of the sundae. It's like extra special, right? Extra, nice things to have on your dessert. But most are not expecting it to get in. We'll see. There's even talk like the big movie Mission Impossible with Tom Cruise opening up at the end of May worldwide. They don't even know like a blockbuster like that getting into China. So no one knows. So you have to assume that it won't. So to your question, is China important to the industry? Yes, but the industry is adapted to say, look, we're not going to make movies assuming it gets into China. We'll make movies assuming it doesn't. So therefore, if it does, okay, great. And also, the percentage a studio gets from China keeps most of the money. So even if it does, like it looks like $100 million in China, you only get a very small percentage of profits afterwards.
So what you're saying is that Hollywood is preparing to be disappointed so that they don't get disappointed in that
Yeah,
case.
well, I think Hollywood has already gotten disappointed in the past, and now knowing that they just it's kind of like they assume we let's assume it doesn't. If it does, that so if it does, then they're happy, right? Like then they're like thinking, okay, it's a good thing if it gets into China, right? So they're just assuming it won't. If it does, it's a bonus.
Oh, that's an interesting method.
Yes, it's a financial method because they can't assume that they will get money from the Chinese box office. And China, I mean, 1.2 billion people. It's a huge market. So it would be a very, very important market if it were opened up, right? If it were opened up to the West,
Mhm.
but it's not right now. So you can't like if you're a Western filmmaker, you can't rely upon it.
But can they rely on getting money from all the other countries in the world? Or are there other countries that
I
have these similar problems?
I don't know what's exactly as of today with all the tariffs, but there is a general quota of number of films allowed in China, and every countries trying to get that filled. If they, let's say it used to be around 30 a year. So every studio, every country was fighting to get it in there. Now, there's ways around it. If you do a co-production with China, or you put the money into a Chinese film, then you could do as many as you want, right? Like it tends to, in general, it tends to be easier. But if you're working with co-production in China, you're working with writers in China, filmmakers in China, it's considered like almost like a Chinese production, then it gets outside the quotas. But if it's purely only made in the US, a Hollywood film, and then it's meant to go to China, that's where the quotas come into play.
And speaking of co-productions, how many co-productions have you worked on?
Me personally, I have done like with my own companies a couple, but if you looked at um, independent film outside of it with the studio system, it's hard to say because so many are co-productions. Well, there's a difference. There's co-productions where you have two co-production companies. Then there's co-productions where they're within the U.S. and then there's co-productions with outside the U.S. You might do it with the UK and U.S. and Germany and U.S. I don't know the exact percentage, but a lot of movies are done that way. Because they're trying to get financing from other parts of the world because it's not cheap to put a movie together. It's independent films. You make them for 2 to 6, then the mid tier are 20 to 40. Then you have the 80 range, and then the blockbusters over $100 million, right? And those are very few, but everyone knows them because they're big blockbusters.
And can an independent film gain global success?
Yes, it's hard because they don't have usually there's two reasons. You don't have the studio backing behind it that has all the PR machine and marketing machine behind it. And then also that comes with financing, with the P&A. They call it P&A. It's basically print and advertising. It's the marketing behind it. So you have to put a lot of money behind it. In general, if you do, there's two ways that I always see that an independent film does a breakout. It just happens to people just seem to love it. It's a unique experience. It's like I call it like capturing lightning in a bottle. It's like you'll see, let's say, a historic example would be the movie Blair Witch, where it just captured the imagination of people. Like, oh my gosh, this is real found footage. It isn't. It's not real found footage, but people thought it was, and it went around the world, right? Or you had from China. People still talk about this every day. Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. That was a Sony Classics film for international, and it just was so unique at the time that everyone talked about it. So that's one way where but that one, the problem I have with that is you can't control it. That one's up to the zeitgeist. That one's up to just happens to be at the right place, right time, perfect story, perfect audience. The other way is you do the film festival route and you bring it to Cannes Film Festival, Venice, Toronto, and you hope it gets awards. Then you hope it gets picked up. You hope it gets into the Oscars. And a good example would be the movie Anora that got a lot of awards at the Oscars this year. So it's a very independent film. What was it, like $6 million, type of thing? And it's a good film, but it did the playbook properly of going to the festivals and getting people behind it. But then once it got a nomination for the Golden Globes, it got a nomination for the Oscars, then it captured people's attention, and then it won the award, and then it started making more money because people said, "Oh, I heard about it. Let me go see it." Right? And so that was the other way. So it's either it just happens to be a lightning in a bottle approach, or it's a very much it does the film festivals, gets awards, people start knowing about it, and then it kind of gets more of a global appeal.
And in what case can an indie film be so successful that it gets shown in a mainstream movie theater?
You could always get shown in a mainstream movie theater. You get how many screens? 10
Oh,
screens, or 100 screens. You can like any movie, you can buy your way. They call it four walling, right? So the all four walls, what you do is you pay for the entire theater, and you say you pay the theater, so they'll give you a few $1,000s. I own it, I'll screen it, and then you could say I had my movie in a movie theater, right? But you bought your way into it, or you negotiate with the theater and say, which is most of the what you do too, is saying for every ticket sold, I get this percentage, 50% of it, or 60% or 40% or whatever you want to negotiate, and you do the ticket splits. So you can always do it that way. The theaters may or may not want to do it. I'll give a good example. 2 years ago, my company, Pangram Entertainment, released a Chinese sports drama called Breaking Through in U.S. theaters. It was like, I want to say it was it was expensive. It was like a $30 million film in China. They wanted it released in the U.S. We did release in the U.S. in two theaters, one in Los Angeles, one in New York, and we focused on it was a Chinese film. It was about China winning their first Olympic gold medal, and it was in the Olympics, Winter Olympics, for speed skating. They did a scripted, it wasn't a documentary. It was a live action with famous actors in China playing the parts, and it was very emotional, with all the tropes of the drama. The female skater, she had to choose between family or the going to the Olympics, and you had that struggle, like, oh my
yeah.
God, her father's dying on his deathbed. Does she visit him or go to the Olympics, and win the award, win the gold for China? So it had all those emotional tropes. But you had, they wanted it in multiple theaters, but it's a Chinese sports drama, right? It's all in
Mm.
Chinese, and it's so we said, look, you can play it in theaters in Los Angeles in a Chinese community called Alhambra, where more Chinese speakers, and also in New York. So we picked two areas where you had more of a Chinese population that would care about it. It was very difficult to get it wider than that, but the second largest theater chain, Regal Theaters, took it and put it into for a week's play. They did 2 to 3 screenings per day for an entire week, in August of 2023, and put it into New York and Los Angeles. So you can, so you can get any type of film, foreign language films, independent films into theaters. There'll always be theaters that may want to play it. I also have friends who are independent filmmakers, and there's certain, auteur independent theaters that love independent films. So they'll always do a premiere. You could do a premiere at one of them. You'll always get theaters wanting to do it. It's whether or not do you make money, right?
Mm.
You could project it into a theater, but then two people show up, right?
Yeah.
So it's so you could get them into theaters. That's not as much of an issue. The issue is more of can you make money, and then how many theaters, right? You're probably not going to get 1,000 theaters or 500 theaters unless you put marketing dollars behind it, and saying you are, or it's done, it's done well at the film festivals.
And since you were just talking about marketing, um, how do you define a good marketing strategy?
I love that question because that's what I did most of my career with marketing movies from the US to the rest of the world, or we took movies from the rest of the world and brought it to the US or other parts of it. Um, a good strategy is understanding what the movie is about and finding those best parts to get people excited about it, right? And there's two ways you do that. You want to make sure that there's awareness. So the goal is to make sure people are aware about a movie, right? So how do you target to the widest audience that would do it? And once they're aware, you could, you want to make sure they're interested in it, right? So it's awareness and interest, right? You can't be interested in something unless you know about it. So the awareness. But if you're aware about it, you might know about it. But Jordy, like you've seen certain trailers, movies, and you're like, oh, I know about it, but there's no way I'm going to pay a movie ticket, because it
Yeah.
doesn't interest me, right? So that's the two parts of the holy grail of marketing is making people aware and then making them those who are aware that are interested in it, And the key part is how do you target who's the right people to make aware about it, right? And that one is I would say more of the data oriented part, like you're going to go after younger males who love horror, right? So then you have to make sure what social media platforms are they on, what type of sites do they listen to, which podcasts do they go to. It's like where do they live, right? Do you want to even do billboards, right? And so you have to kind of figure out from a pure data research perspective. It's a lot of data oriented of trying to figure out what's the best way to go about it. Then there's the art about it, the creative. Like, okay, so how do you take this 2 hour movie and make it into a 2 minute trailer? Or how do you take these images and put it, and capture the essence in a poster or a digital post or through publicity unit photography? So that is kind of where you're trying to mix the data oriented with the arts aspect of it, the creative aspect of it, and then you mix the creative. Sometimes you'll test trailers with target audiences and you'll sit through many of these where you show trailers, you show posters, you even show movies, right? And then you ask them what do they think about it, and you have to figure out what's the best way to do it, and then every country is different. If you look at movie posters, very often are different in Europe than they are in US than in Asia, and particularly Japan. Japan is always like Mars to me. They always do different posters every single time. And if you ever go to the movie database and go into pick a movie and pick the media section, they break down all posters by country and language, and you get to see a really interesting examples of how it's done around the world. And that's where they target, the specifics of the art, the art part of it, towards the audience.
So that's what you're saying means targeting their audience, and you're also saying that it's better to target one specific audience and not the entire world.
I know it's you actually want to. So if you have so I gave the horror example. It's a very specific audience, but you have this thing called 4 quadrants in Hollywood, which means males over 35 and under 35, 2 boxes, females over 35, under 35. They call it a 4 quadrant. That's the holy grail. Blockbusters can do that. It basically means you're going after everybody, right? But we know there's no movie that's for everybody, but that's a big one. If you have a very specific, let's say a romantic comedy, you're going to go after rom-com fans that tend to skew female, right? If you have talent who's older, you might go to older audiences. If it's younger, you'll go younger audiences. Or if it's animation, a very young animation movie, you're going to skew younger. You're going to skew kids and families, right? That's the big core audience. You have a primary audience as kids and families. Then you might have secondary ones that are fans, adult fans of that type of comic growing up or whatever, that animation growing up. So you know where the majority is, but it doesn't mean you only target them. You could target other smaller ones, but very particular. But it depends how much money do you have. If you have a limited budget, you can't try to go after everybody. You try to go after the primary audience, right? Type of thing. And you typically want to go after the ones that appreciate the genre, the story, that go to that, is it rom-com? Is it a horror? Is it a sci-fi? Is it action? Is it drama? Then there's within horror, there's a horror, psychological horror, psychological thriller, horror thriller, slasher thriller, gore thriller, it's like gore horror, there's all these nuances, type of thing. So, but you only know that through the type of movie that's been created, right? After you see the movie or read the script.
And what happens before a movie's released, but before the audience can see it in theaters?
In an ideal world for bigger films, I love working on a film 2 years out. You read the script, you start thinking of ideas, you start trying to figure out how do you go on set to capture images, interviews, so on, while they're making the movie. So you have this stuff you can use for marketing. Most marketing tends to be the majority of the media spend happens a month before. The publicity, you want to start working almost 2 years out, year and a half, getting press on sets, get used to it. They might not write about it, you might not hear about it much, but you start banking this content, holding it back. The press you want to do early on because they need to write the articles. They'll do their top 10 movies in spring, top 10 movies in summer, right? And so even if you're at the end of summer, they start writing about it. They're already doing it now. Here is April, right? So you want to have them start thinking about your movie in advance, even though if you might not be spending money like in media, like on advertising and billboards and digital, the press starts getting involved with it early on. So there's a lot of work, legwork beforehand. So, but each department is different. If the creative team has to start working on trailers and posters or teaser poster, they might do a teaser poster a year out, right? So they have to work on that. Then they do a more of a final poster or final trailer closer to release. Then they have to do cut TV spots. So you have a lot of work leading up to it. Or if it's a bigger movie, promotions, how do you get Burger King or Audi cars or Omega watches involved, right? So they have to know about the movie in advance, so they can do it. The great thing about getting promotional partners, but again, independent films, it's hard to do because it's not a brand. If they don't know about it, they're not going to put really money behind it. It's the bigger movies, like the Barbies or Minecraft, that type of thing where you can do early on. But the great thing about it is that those partners, or even James Bond, for example, they had the vodka company, Smirnoff, they have Omega watches, they have Aston Martin cars, they have Range Rover car. I mean, they have a bunch of cars, and they have clothing lines, right? So those companies, Omega watches, you'll see they put a print advertising in a magazine, Omega watch, and you might see James Bond, wearing it. Omega pays for that advertisement, not the studio. So the studio can spend the money on TV spots and trailers and so on, and then Omega could put money into promoting the movie through their watch or Smirnoff through the vodka. They use their own money, so now they're promoting it. So now you have even more money being put to promote the movie, right? Or it's on a cereal box if it's a kid's property, right? The cereal company starts marketing it with their own money. So you don't, as a studio, you don't have to spend that money. You're using other people's money, and they called it earned media because you just gave them content, the movie, and then they use it in their advertising to promote to their products as well as others. And there's other ways to get around to, like you talked about ratings. Do you work on ratings, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, those you could do it last minute. That's art and science as well. You have to work with the ratings bureau, and they'll tell you what to cut out or what to remove. And you only have to say the word fuck 4 times. Less than 4 times, it could be PG-13. More than that, they talk about nudity. They have all these very, very specific, weird rules. And you have to negotiate with them sometimes on it. But even if you are an R film, you can't target people in the US then under 17, or PG-13, you can't target under 13. Well, if you're Spider-Man, people are younger, like say PG-13, but they're younger, 8 and 9 year olds go. You can't, as a studio, spend media targeting 8 year olds. But if you put Spider-Man on a cereal box and the cereal company advertises their cereal with Spider-Man on it, they are allowed to target any audience because it's cereal, but it happens to be Spider-Man on it. So then that's a way around ratings if you want to target audiences if you're using other people's products to do so.
And is that entirely legal? Like if the cereal
Yeah, they can do
promotes?
it. Yeah, legal. Yeah, that is. But again, every country is different, right? Like the US, it's called the MPA, Motion Picture Association. They give the ratings. They have a ratings board that has another acronym, and there's people that just do the PG-13, R, NC-17, and so on ratings, right? Or G is even there. Then every country. Germany is different. The UK has their own difference. The Middle East and their countries there differently. Brazil, Mexico, Japan. Every country has a different, and some are government oriented. The U.S. is more of a self-regulating through MPA because they didn't want back in the 30s to have the government involved. So they said we'll do it our own so that the government doesn't get involved, right? And so it's very different for every country.
And would you say Hollywood is really doing well with that?
My opinion, I think it's very smart because you don't in our capitalist society, you don't want the government at times to regulate your industry as an industry, right? You just don't want that. So they were smart to actually say we will regulate it ourselves, through the major studios being part of it, right? And then they have parent groups on part of it too. Doesn't mean that some parent groups are not happy with it at times, fine, but it's better that they stay within the certain norms of society. Now, a rating changes. What was ratings approved 30 years ago, wouldn't get past 30 years ago, it gets past now, so it kind of all, so ratings are a reflection of our own society, right? Ratings are a reflection of our own morality. Ratings are a reflection of what we perceive as good and bad or worthy of showing or not, or certain age groups. So it can be, you can also get things done a little bit more quicker and negotiate more. Is it perfect? No. But would it be perfect by the government? No. It's neither here nor there.
Since we were also just talking about Hollywood, would you say they're gaining success right now, or are they actually losing it?
Yeah, that's the tough question, right? I would say it's very, very tough right now for Hollywood because you had the streamers come in like Netflix and Amazon and so on. Then you have the pandemic, which we taught everyone to stay at home and binge watch and do everything through. You couldn't even go into a movie theater, right? Like the first time I saw a movie, I had to drive an hour and a half to a different county in Orange County from here to see Christopher Nolan's movie Tenet, right? Because that was the first movie theater that opened up after the pandemic, right? And it wasn't easy. It was like you have to drive an hour and a half to go see this movie, right? At the time. But we were sitting for a year not watching movies in theaters. You were getting used to it. Then we had the strikes, the writer strike, the actor strike, the other year. So it was a very tough with the streamers, with the pandemic, with the strikes. So Hollywood's been hit pretty hard, with being able to create content because of the strikes, and the pandemic, and it'll slowly get there. But we're training people to watch stuff at home. Also, what you're seeing is, I think it's helped outside of Hollywood. Let's say, particularly local content, right? Because all of a sudden you're like, you don't have Hollywood content. Okay, well, we have stuff in Germany for the UK or Japan or Korea and so on. And also because people are used to watching stuff at home, they're more likely to watch something from Korea, or Brazil or France, right? And it doesn't even mean the US. It means you in Germany are probably watching some more foreign films. I mean, you were more used to it in general, but now it's a little bit more of the norm, used to seeing subtitles, and dubbed from other parts of the world because you didn't have as much of the Hollywood content, and I think every country has that more local pride where they're seeing more interest in what is being done on the local level, and you're seeing that definitely in Latin America, particularly Asia Pacific. That's where you're seeing they have really strong local markets, really strong local content, and Hollywood might have the big blockbusters come in, great, but I don't think it has the same pedigree and the strength that it had in the past.
And what would Hollywood have to change in order to avoid these problems they're having right now, like with releasing or with the critics?
Yeah, it's tough. That one's a tough one. I would say this is just my own opinion on it is a paying more attention to the rest of the world in the type of stories that people want now, right? And seeing themselves in the stories, and then focusing and keeping focused on really good stories. I mean, at the end of the day, regardless of if it's Hollywood or whether it's from Germany or Japan or Brazil, it has to be a great story. You know, it has to be really good. My concern is that people just, I call it beating a dead horse. It's the same horse, and you're just trying to get it to run, and you're like, no, it's that's not going to make it work. You need to, you need to, like Marvel is a good example. It's people are tired of superheroes constantly. Every single movie is a superhero, and there's so many of them, right? You know, and so
Yeah.
how many can you do that? Like, and they're not original. I mean, they're original, but they're not. You know, after a while, it's like people want to have really good stories, original stories. They don't need the same one many times over, right? You know, and so it will be interesting to see what happens with James Bond because James Bond only was a movie every 3, 4 years, right? You know, and it was unique and special, and it was a wonderful story, and the world saw it. If Amazon now makes this movie, you know, makes it like Marvel or Star Wars spin-offs and multiple ones, will people care as much, right? Will it have that pedigree that it does when it goes around the world? You know, I think James Bond is a great example of one that every country wants to see. Um, they have to also, the key thing is not overspend, because if you can make you can make a wonderful movie, but if it doesn't make its money back, it's considered a failure because then no one's going to put more money into the sequel. So they have to figure out how can you make money for wonderful movies for less so that when it does make money and it's success, there's money to be able to make the next one and the next one and the next one, right? So it's still a business. You know, it's very, you know, it's always the struggle. It's like, is it, you know, film is an art, film is commercial, right? Is it wrong to make a movie just for the art's sake and you don't make money? Yeah, there's wonderful movies out there, but me personally, it's not a sustainable business. Then it's more grants. It's someone says, okay, I'll give you money knowing I'm not going to get money back. It's like giving money to museums or art or whatever it is, right? You know, so great, you can do that. But at the end of the day, if you want it to be consistent, to be able to see multiple movies, multiple IPs, it still has to make the money. So to your point, I still think they have to make certain movies more realistic budgets to be able to make money so that they make more of them. And right now, they've been putting, I think in some movies they're way too expensive, and box office seems like it does well, but it's still lost money.
If a movie doesn't make that much money directly, can the company still profit of it if it makes money over the years?
You can. I think the issue, so right now the model is you want to make money profit in theaters, right? And then you go to downstream, like, you know, the VOD platforms, whether it's subscription, advertising based, whatever it might be, you know, the Netflix and Amazons and so on, and Movies and Tubies and Voodoos, and so, you know, there's like so many, so many of those. Then it goes into, you know, then it goes into the broadcast where you see it on your TV, you know, or you can buy it and so on. So there's, yeah, you can make your money downstream in the long tail, you know, they call it. So it's just like, you know, they might, you know, over time you make a little bit more. But if you don't release it into a movie theater, right, and into a certain number of screens, the deals that studios have with downstream, whether it's TV or so on, they'll have in the contracts that says, we will pay you $30,000 for that movie if you release it in over 100 theaters, movie theaters. If you don't, then you don't get that money, you know, type of thing. So the studios are behooved to release it in theaters because it shows it's big. They put the money behind it. People are aware about it. And then it makes more money behind it. If you don't put it into a movie theater, the deals just in, you know, VOD and, you know, TV rights afterwards, they're a lot smaller, right? So there is always really interest from a business perspective to release it into movie theaters. And also, you like it had you want you also wanted to do well because I'll give an example. There was a Will Smith movie with his son Jaden Smith. It was called After Earth.
Mhm.
And After Earth was about them, you know, they I don't know, I keep forgetting whether it was Earth. They came back to Earth and crashed on the planet, and you know, Will Smith hurt himself and he was stuck on this ship, and then his son had to go around, you know, on the planet to, you know, to save them. And there were months where we're talking about, oh, you know, it's Will Smith, it's a big movie, it's After Earth, it's action, it's sci-fi, it's huge, it's gonna be big. And we talked
Unavoidable.
about, yeah, it was like, but we had these discussions of like, okay, so we'll do comic book spin-offs and video games, and we'll do TV series, and you do this they call it transmedia, like transmedia, cross media. So there's theaters and TV shows and publishing and comic books and video games and you name it, licensing and merchandising and T-shirts and all this. And there's so many meetings we were in and talking about it. And then the movie opened and it didn't do well. All that discussion about publishing and video games and TV, that just disappeared overnight
And it didn't
because
work.
it didn't work. And so that's why I always tell people, like, make the movie do well, successful, then
One
figure
thing
out
at a
all the stuff in
time.
it. You can do it. Yes, then you can do it.
Yeah.
But it's a waste of time unless you know it. And they could have done it if, because you had Will Smith and it was a big blockbuster. I mean, independent filmmaker for a small budget film, you don't even go that route. Just because it's rare. Let it do well. Make sure it does great, and then talk about it afterwards. If it's still there, you could do another movie, whatever. If it's sequel type of movie, then fine. But it has to work. Again, profit, right? It has to make money. You know, People like that. I mean, it's not a bad movie. It's just it was expensive and it didn't do as well as people hoped it would be.
And I'm going to name a few examples of movies that did do well. For example, the Minecraft movie. Like,
Yes,
yeah,
yes,
like everyone, like last summer, everyone was like, oh, it's going to be so terrible. And Jack Black looks nothing like Steve.
yep, yep,
And now they're all raging in the movie theaters
yep.
and annoying the movie theaters themselves.
Yeah. I,
And can you tell me, like, how does that happen? Like, how does a movie shift audience expectations so well that they freak out in a movie theater?
Yeah, I would first of all, Warner Brothers did a great job in marketing it. They did. They had a great IP, but that you ca- all the planning you do, no one knew that you would freak out in the movie theater. No one knew that Jack Black would be so great about it, right? Like you hope he will be. You hope people will love it, because what you see on script versus the director and the actors and the editing and all of that, there's so much art behind it that you could have the best script in the world, and you could have the most famous video game IP, Minecraft, in the world, and it could still be a horrible movie because you didn't capture that chemistry. And that's that lightning in a bottle. Trying to capture that lightning in a bottle is, you can't, there's no one can predict it. I don't think anyone predicted that Minecraft would do that well. And now that it is, then they start putting more market, they start finding money and put more marketing behind it, and you use that for publicity and getting behind it, and so on, and having fun with it. I think what Warner Brothers was smart is allowing the audiences to have fun with it, when they know it's a good movie, right? But you just never know from script to final edit how it's going to be. There's so much uncontrolled. There can be, there's stuff like in the media. What happens if Minecraft, the company, people started turning against it because it did something stupid from a publicity perspective, or Jack Black got in a scandal, right? That you can't control human behavior. That's the
Yeah.
the hardest part. If he did something, people would turn against him, and you've seen that happen very often with actors, right? You see that with scandals happening, and the studios freak out because they're like, oh my god, now they're in the lawsuit with their spouse, they're the sexual misconduct, right? And it messes things up. And so there's so many things that are so hard to control, and Minecraft just happened to find all the right things, and it happened to all come at the same time. Another good example would be, the other summer, Barbie and Oppenheimer, and the
Yeah.
Barbie phenomenal. No marketing person said, we're going to call it, Barbenheimer. It wasn't, the audiences, the zeitgeist, what's happening in the news, the culture, society, it just kind
It
of
became a
all,
meme.
yeah, yeah, exactly. How do you control
Yeah.
memes? You can put memes out there hoping people will do it, but you don't know, right? It's
Yeah.
hard, and they just happen to very lucky, but they also strategically they put together a great movie, and they put together good marketing materials, and so it allowed it for that meme ability to take off. They put everything there in place so it could happen, right? And so But they couldn't say this meme will do it, right? Like,
Mm.
no one could factor that in at all.
But these were all movies that were based off something, either a video game or a toy. So
Hmm.
that means if you make a movie and you stick to the source material, then can you be assured that it's going to be a good movie?
No, no, because you there's two. Yeah, it's interesting because if you deal with an IP that has very strong opinions, right? They're like, you can't change this at all because it's pure, because the book was this way, the game was this way, and so on. It gives the small fan base community too much control because then you can't get it wider because people might be like, well, you need to be able to adapt it. First of all, adapting a book or a game into a movie is it's difficult, right? Because you're trying to put it into a smaller time, 2 hour time frame, and the storytelling visual, like books are reading materials versus film is a visual material, right? Gaming, you get to choose what you do versus a movie, you tell what it's going to happen, right? So it's a very hard thing to do properly, right? You could be a great novelist. In my opinion, I think you saw it with J.K. Rowling. She's great at Harry Potter, but then you hire screenwriters that know how to adapt the novel into a movie, right? And then that did really well with Harry Potter, but then she had a lot of control over the spin-offs, the Fantastic Beasts. They didn't do as well because she insisted she had to do the writing. And she's a great novelist, but not necessarily a script writer, right? And she had too much control on that, aspect of it. Anyway, that's very confidential. So it's a very, very difficult thing to kind of come across. So you want to be able to have flexibility to sometimes maybe make the fans a little uncomfortable because they're like, it's not pure, but you want wider audiences that normally wouldn't go see it to see it, right?
Mm.
And so having fun with it, but not going veering too far off from it. Another good example I would say is Lord of the Rings. I love the books. I love the Peter Jackson films. I think he was able to have fun with it and took it a little bit more, a little different at times. The Amazon series, Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, there I heard the family had a lot of saying they're trying to be so true, more true to it, and it's boring. It's like it's not the same. It doesn't have the same, and it hasn't been doing as well. That was expensive. That was very expensive to do, right? Like $500 million for the first season, and then the second one, who knows? But so it's you have to be able to, here good. Barbie's a good example. That a lot of that movie wasn't in the Barbie lore. They just Mattel was said have fun with it. Allow them to do it. It still keeps with Barbie the core of who she is, but they made fun of her, which was unusual, right? It's risky, but it did well.
And they even played with Ken a little bit.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. And that wasn't in it, so they had fun, so, and that's what made it actually really broad is because it wasn't so, if you just watched exactly Ken and Barbie the way it was always portrayed, it would never become the movie that it is and the success in the global
Mm.
box office that it is.
Would you say Hollywood is better making money in the international box office or in the local box office?
I would say they're better right now in local because it's harder international, right? It's just been harder because international has a lot of good product right now, like local
Mm.
Mexican product, local German product, local UK product, local Korean product. So it's more competitive. Let's put it this way: it's just more competitive. So there's a lot more. Every country wants to see their own language, their own people, and so on. It makes sense. They might have not have had that in the past. Now you do.
Yeah. So it's clear that in order to release a movie worldwide, you have to do the voice dubbing really well. But I've heard that a lot of people are not really happy with the translating or the voice dubbing. Like, can you
What's the
tell me
step?
maybe why that is?
I'm not sure. I don't, because it's weird. There's not a lot of countries that have the strength of voice actors the way France and Germany, Spain, Italy do, right? It's very much, European. Most are subtitled. Um, you actually have voice actors that are stars, like people know them, right? Type of
Mm.
thing. You don't, US, you might, animation, you have famous actors doing voiceovers, but they won't, but that's not animation. That's different than live action, right? You don't see
Yeah.
that in live action here. Um, I think the bigger issue is more of, is AI going to do the voiceovers, right? Or is AI use the voice of an actor that gives the right to it, but then they might not be saying all lines. They give you just enough, and then they adapt it through AI. That's the bigger issue, that they're seeing from the actor's perspective, on that part. Um, but my question to you is, what are they saying in Germany that they don't like the voices of the actors? They're not that good, or is it what are they saying?
They're saying like it sounds unnatural. Like it doesn't feel real what they're saying and how they sound
Oh, is it only
in
recent?
comparison to the original English version.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah, okay, yeah. I mean, well, no, it's going to change. It'll be interesting because even the lips still, you can do it as much as you can, and it's a little off, type of thing. AI CGI is going to change that. I've seen stuff where the lips move with the voice. They kind of
Mm.
change it so it sounds so much more natural. I think give it time, But I mean, let's put it this way: the famous voice actors, or probably, that job is going to go away. It's like, it's going to be probably be more of, know what it's going to be? It'll be Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible using his voice,
Mm.
but in German with the CGI moving the lips so it actually says it in German, right? Like that's the
Yeah.
future of what voiceover is going to be. It's not going to be hiring some famous deep voice doing, that's known for doing Tom Cruise in Germany and German all the time, and being beholden to that one voice. You'll be actually using Tom Cruise's voice through AI and then using the special effects to actually move the lips to be perfectly aligned with the language. That's what's probably going to happen.
That might actually convince people who don't speak the original language to watch the movie in German
Yeah,
or in another
yeah,
translated language, right?
totally, totally. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what's probably going to happen. Yeah,
Yeah, it sounds very interesting.
yeah. It
Yeah.
is. AI is gonna, people complain about it. It's gonna change. AI will change things. I think for the better. I mean, technology, if it's used right, adapted right, it helps. We saw that people always said the internet's a fad when I was doing the internet and working for the dot coms. You couldn't live. Here we are on video. You couldn't live without the
Mm.
internet, right?
Yeah.
And it created new opportunities, new jobs, new creativity, and so AI is not going to go away. Let's put it that way. So then
Mm.
might as well learn how to harness it and use it as a tool to enhance the creativity, right? That's what it's really for.
One other question about filming abroad. Like so many movies are filmed abroad for various reasons. Can you maybe tell me why those reasons are?
Yeah, the biggest reasons are money. It's tax incentives. It's going to a place where it's less expensive. Right now, when I was reading articles this morning, it's so expensive to film in the US. So
Mm.
expensive to film in LA. So they are down 21% even more this quarter in filming in Los Angeles. And you think, oh my God, it's Hollywood. We're filming in Hollywood. It's too
Mm.
expensive. So they get tax rebates in Spain, Hungary. They go to Mexico. They could go,
New
other parts of
Zealand.
the U.S. Yeah, New Zealand. Yeah, anywhere.
Yeah.
And they get the tax incentive. So that is a big part of it. The other one is the locations. If you want to do a skiing movie, you want to, do it somewhere in the Alps, right? You need a desert. Go to Morocco, where they give you tax rebates and you have the desert. Um, Sometimes it's based upon talent. Talent lives there, where it is, or the co-production. We talked earlier about, if you do co-productions, they bring in money, they want it filmed also there, but I think the biggest one really is coming down to the tax incentives, production incentives,
Mm.
by country. In the US, it's interesting. The US, there's no federal one. You don't go to the US to film. You have to go to each state. Each state competes. Georgia, Louisiana, New Jersey, California, and in other parts of the world, it's the country, but then sometimes regionally they'll have it in a city. They might do city additional ones, but that's where it's a little different than the U.S. U.S. does it by state. Countries tend to do it by country.
So you're saying that there's an inner competition inside the states of US.
Yep.
I've never
So
thought of that before.
every time you're doing you're putting your budgets together and you said, here's these actors, here's how much it will cost. Can I bring them down? Oh, if I go to Georgia, I get 30+% rebate,
Oh, wow.
and they're all different. Sometimes they have rules. You have to have certain number of cast. You have to hire a certain number of people in Georgia. You have to do a certain number of days in Georgia. You have to show your receipts that you spent money there. Others, might be more of, okay, we will give you money up front to be able to go to the state to kind of start filming because they want each state and country wants more people there to spend money. They'll give you money, so they're hoping that you spend money and then it creates more local economy. But also then, oh, people see that it was done in Georgia. Well, look at the beautiful locations. It's like New Zealand. You said New Zealand got Lord of the Rings, right? Filmed there. People, the movies, right? They're like, oh, what a
Mhm.
beautiful. That has brought so much tourism, to New Zealand. Downton Abbey as a TV series. Oh my God, people going to Britain and going to see the castle in Downton Abbey, right? They want to see that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it helps with tourism. So some states, some countries do it for tourism, some do it for the local economy, some to boost up more people working locally. So there's multiple reasons for it. But when you're a producer, you have to look at how much money you can get going to it. Now, you have to be realistic because it costs money to still fly people there, but sometimes it's still cheaper to fly people and put them in a hotel than to film it in California, right?
Mhm.
Or you need a desert scene. You're not going to do it in the mountains, right? You're probably not doing desert scenes in Switzerland, right? Or Bavaria, right?
No.
And, not doing it in Ireland. You want green, go to Ireland, right? And so you have to kind of weigh, the locations with incentives, so there's a lot in play that you have to do.
Yeah. And were you ever in charge of merchandising?
No,
Like
I wasn't
announcing the
responsible for
merchandise
that.
or
Yeah, no, that there's a separate group. Usually it's called consumer products. The consumer products group in a studio controls the merchandising and licensing. They might have a separate arm under consumer products to do licensing and merchandising. And then there's a lot of agencies they hire that specifically do regional, what's done in different regions. They might be specifics on publishing or t-shirts or getting into retail or working with, the QSRs, quick service restaurants. QSRs are short for like McDonald's and Burger King and Carl's Jr. and so on. So there's certain agencies you hire to kind of handle those deals.
Hmm. I didn't know about all these agencies and all these
Oh yeah, yeah.
groups.
There's hundreds, if not like thousands of agencies that are behind the studio system. Every time I tell people when they want to break into Hollywood, they're like, "Oh my God, I want to work for the one of the five studios or even Netflix, Amazon." And I said, "There's so few jobs there. Most work for the creative agencies that make the trailers. Work for because it's not done in-house. It's always they hired. Work for the digital agencies, the media agencies, the promotional agencies, the licensing agencies. There's it's almost like an ecosystem of like the studios are the big planets and then they have all the little moons circling around them. There's so many moons around Jupiter and Neptune and so on, right?
Yeah.
That people just don't know about, but that's where a lot of the money in business is. And then you get your job there and then maybe you get hired by the studio because then you work on their products, right? Type of thing. So that's where I say there's like an entire huge ecosystem of agencies, that help promote it.
And what are the most famous agencies in
It
that
depends.
perspective or
Yeah,
in
it's
that
like if you want, and if you come to Hollywood, you'll see Trailer Park. They do all the, huge trailers, posters, that you'll see here, a lot of them. There's a bunch of big ones like Trailer Park and Farm, they're big agencies that do the creative, right? And then you have separate ones that do promotions and digital and media buying. Like the media buying, you tend to hire agencies like OMD and UM are big media agencies that do the buying for the studios, and then they have multiple sub agencies underneath that, So
Hmm.
then there's agencies who only buy billboards, right? And So there's enough agencies that help out with it.
And also, my other question was, when an audience watches a movie, again, there are like two types of approvals, like an audience's approval and a critic's approval, right?
Mhm.
Um, like how does a critic rate a movie, um, comparing to how the audience rates a movie?
They're both very important, right? Because sometimes the critics might not like it, but the audiences do, and it does well. Or if the critics love it, the audiences don't. It does, ultimately, if the audiences don't like the movie, it's not going to be commercial, right? But you use the critic. The critics are important because we as humans, we are very influenced by what people say, whether good or bad.
Hmm.
If people initially put the seed out there, like the critics see it early and they say, "Oh my God, this is going to be, I hear this is good, it's going to be good." You're more likely like, "Oh, someone else who likes it. Oh, maybe I'll like it." If someone starts out immediately says, "Oh my God, I hate that movie," or personally, it's like, "Oh my God," you hear someone saying, "I hate that person." When if you meet that person, you're going to be a little bit more cautious, right? You don't know them, but you heard something bad about them, right? And then it takes more time and effort to build up that trust to say, do I like them? Because someone told you you don't like them, right? But if someone says you like them, you're more likely to be amenable to talking with them, and they might still be a horrible person and you find out
Hmm.
later that they aren't, but you kind of give them the chance because that seed, that initial seed in your mind of good or bad is stuck in there. So the critics, you want them to start it off so that when the audience hears about it or sees it and da da da, it's better to start for the audience in the mind, oh, the critics like it, da 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 da. They're more likely to do it. Now, we've seen many times where the critics love it and the audiences then watch and hate it, or the critics don't like it, or the critics don't like it and the audiences love it, right? But you want, if as a studio, if they do it right, they get the critics on board, and then they want a great movie and the audiences to love it. So it's this ecosystem you have to work. So
And my other question was, um, like I've heard that Jurassic World by Universal Pictures was like the most successful movie in the box office internationally. And can you tell me how that became so? Like what made it the most successful movie back in 2015?
it was a great IP. People love dinosaurs. It was started with a great story with Steven Spielberg behind it. You had a perfect combo, with it. Back in, the Jurassic Park, and then they did a really good spinoff. I mean, people love action, people
Hmm.
love dinosaurs. It comes from a great IP, right? You have so many people who already loved the previous movies beforehand. And then they just happen to find the right, the story, the script happened to be made well with the right actors, right director. They put it all well together. So but it's do they know it will be the best movie ever? No, no one will ever know. It's like they hope, you aim for it, but it's still beyond the control, of
Yeah,
what the audience wants and what's happening in the world too.
yeah. We all hope for good luck.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, yeah,
We do.
yeah. So thank you for your time.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful to know about all of this. And
Yes.
there are so many different aspects where we could go on, we could talk
Yeah.
forever about
Yes.
this.
Definitely. Definitely. So it was wonderful, Jordy. First of all, wish everything best with the class, and also say hi to your parents and let me know if you have any other questions afterwards. More than glad to help.
Thank you. I will.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Take care.
Bye. See you
Bye
in
bye.
theaters.
Yes, yes. Buy your movie tickets.
Yeah, I will. And the others
Perfect.
will too.
Good. Take
Yeah.
care.